Picture an empire so wealthy, so dominant, and so certain of its own permanence. Its own citizens joked that its currency would outlast the gods themselves. It controlled trade routes across 3 continents. It fed millions of people it never met. It built highways, still standing 2,000 years later. And it convinced its own population that collapse was simply impossible. Then, slowly and quietly, that economy began to rot from the inside. There was no single dramatic battle marking the exact moment it happened. No one day when everyone suddenly realized the empire was dying. But within a few generations, the most powerful civilization on Earth was unrecognizable. This is the story of Rome's economy. And it is also, disturbingly, a mirror. Because almost every warning sign that quietly ended the Roman economy is flashing somewhere in the American economy right now, and almost nobody is watching for it. Welcome to Economy Rewind History. This is ancient Rome's economy, compared, decision by decision, to modern America. To understand why this comparison matters so much, you first have to understand Rome itself, because the Roman economy was genuinely advanced. Most people picture togas, gladiators, and marble ruins, but they forget something far more important. At its peak, Rome ran something remarkably close to a modern integrated economy. At its height, in the 2nd century, the Roman Empire stretched across enormous territory. From Britain to North Africa to the Middle East, it contained an estimated 50 to 90 million people, all connected by a shared currency, a shared legal system, and roughly 250,000 miles of engineered roads. Many of those roads were built with such precision that portions are still walkable today. Rome ran what economists now recognize as an early form of globalized trade. Grain from Egypt fed the city of Rome itself. Wine from Gaul, modern-day France, was shipped across the Mediterranean. Spices, silk, and glassware traveled enormous distances. Some came from as far away as India and China. They arrived in Roman markets through a vast network of trade routes, a network stretching across the known world. A merchant in Rome could genuinely purchase goods made thousands of miles away. To anyone outside the empire's borders, that would have felt almost magical. And to anyone shopping online today, it feels strangely familiar. At the center of this entire system sat Roman currency, specifically a silver coin called the denarius. For centuries, the denarius functioned like an early international reserve currency. It was trusted and accepted across many different regions, across many cultures, and across a massive imperial economy. In that sense, it played a role similar to the US dollar today. The dollar functions as the world's dominant reserve currency, and the denarius once held a similar kind of imperial trust. But this trust was not accidental. It was deliberately engineered. Early Roman emperors understood something essential about money. A currency's value depends on people's confidence that it will hold its worth. For generations, the denarius was minted with consistent silver content. That reliability made trade easier, it made taxation smoother, and it made long-term contracts possible across millions of square miles. Rome also built something surprisingly close to a modern welfare and infrastructure state. The government provided free or heavily subsidized grain to hundreds of thousands of citizens, especially in the capital. Historians call this program the grain dole. It was funded through taxes and tribute collected from conquered provinces. Rome also funded massive public works projects, aqueducts, roads, bathhouses, and amphitheaters. These projects employed huge numbers of laborers and engineers. In some ways, they resembled modern government infrastructure programs designed to stimulate employment, improve public life, and strengthen the state at the same time. But here is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Because the very foundations that made the Roman economy so powerful were also planting the seeds of its collapse, quietly, slowly, and almost invisibly. Rome's economy was fundamentally built on conquest. Enormous amounts of wealth flowed into the empire because Roman armies kept expanding its borders. Gold, silver, slaves, grain, and tribute. All of it poured into Rome from defeated peoples and conquered provinces. This is a critical detail, because it means Rome's economic engine depended on perpetual military expansion. The same way a company built on aggressive growth depends on constantly acquiring new customers, just to keep its growth numbers looking healthy. As long as the legions kept winning, the system worked. As long as new provinces kept getting absorbed, new wealth kept flowing in. That new wealth helped cover the empire's enormous expenses. But by the 2nd century, Rome had essentially reached its practical limits. There was no more profitable, easily conquerable territory left to absorb, at least not without overextending supply lines, military resources, and administrative control beyond what was sustainable. When the conquest stopped, the flow of new wealth slowed dramatically, but the government's spending obligations did not slow down at all. The military still had to be paid, the grain dole still had to be funded, massive public works still had to be maintained, and the empire still had to project strength across thousands of miles. This created a structural problem that should sound eerily familiar, especially to anyone who has studied a modern government budget. Spending obligations kept growing, while the easy sources of new revenue were quietly running dry. Faced with this widening gap between spending and income, Roman emperors made a dangerous decision, one that would eventually prove catastrophic. And perhaps the most important economic lesson in this entire story. Rather than cutting spending or raising direct taxes high enough to cover the shortfall, they chose another path, because cutting spending risked angering the public, and raising taxes too aggressively risked unrest, even rebellion. So emperors began quietly debasing the currency. They reduced the actual silver content inside each denarius, but they still declared the coin worth the same face value as before. In the 1st century, a denarius contained close to 95% pure silver. By the middle of the 3rd century, that same coin contained less than 5% silver. It had become almost a worthless piece of base metal, dressed up to look like the trusted currency Roman citizens had relied on for generations. This was not a one-time event. It was a slow, repeated pattern. Stretched across multiple emperors and multiple generations, each one made the same short-term calculation: quietly print more money, quietly reduce the silver content, and hope ordinary citizens would not notice, or would not be able to do anything about it, even if they did. Predictably, prices for ordinary goods began rising dramatically, because the actual value of the currency was collapsing. Today, we call this inflation. And by the 3rd century, Rome experienced one of the most severe currency collapses in ancient history. Prices for basic goods rose by staggering multiples, within just a few decades. The empire had not simply spent too much, it had quietly destroyed trust in its own money. This monetary collapse triggered a cascade of consequences that historians now recognize as strikingly similar to modern economic crisis patterns. As trust in Roman currency evaporated, merchants increasingly refused to accept it at face value. They demanded larger and larger quantities of debased coins for the same goods, or they reverted entirely to barter and trade in kind. This was a startling regression, especially for a civilization that had once run a sophisticated currency-based economy, an economy spanning 3 continents. Roman soldiers also began losing faith in the system. Their loyalty and effectiveness depended heavily on reliable pay. But as their wages lost real purchasing power, resentment grew. This contributed directly to political instability, military mutinies, and a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. During this crisis, the empire cycled through dozens of different emperors. In just a few decades, many were assassinated or overthrown by their own troops, sometimes within months of taking power. In the year 301, Emperor Diocletian tried to address the chaos. He issued a famous edict fixing maximum prices across the empire. It covered hundreds of goods and services. Essentially, it was an ancient attempt at government price controls, a desperate effort to fight runaway inflation, but it failed almost immediately because merchants simply stopped selling goods at artificially low mandated prices. Instead of solving inflation, the policy created widespread shortages. The real problem had not been fixed, and this pattern has repeated throughout history. Modern economists have watched similar failures in different forms, from Venezuela to Zimbabwe to wartime price control experiments. Again and again, the lesson returns. You cannot fix a collapse in monetary trust by simply commanding prices to behave. Now let's talk directly about where modern America echoes this ancient pattern, because the comparison here is not casual, and it is not exaggerated, it is structural. The United States dollar today functions as the world's dominant reserve currency. It is trusted and held by central banks and institutions across the globe. In functional terms, it plays a role similar to the Roman denarius. The denarius once held that role across the ancient Mediterranean world. Rome discovered something dangerous about trusted currency status. It creates an enormous temptation. Instead of confronting difficult fiscal choices directly, rulers can simply create more money. Modern America has faced a similar temptation. It has increasingly relied on expanding its money supply and running historically large government deficits. Those deficits help fund massive spending obligations, military spending, entitlement programs, infrastructure investment, and other long-term commitments. Often, this spending is funded without raising taxes enough to fully match the actual cost. This is not a claim that America is about to collapse exactly like Rome. That would be too simple and too dramatic. It is an observation about incentives. Both civilizations discovered the same tempting shortcut. When your currency is trusted globally, you can stretch the system further than others can. And when citizens do not fully understand monetary mechanics, the shortcut becomes even easier. It becomes politically easier to expand the money supply quietly, easier than cutting spending, easier than raising taxes, and easier than telling the public the full cost of the promises already made. The parallels become even more striking when you examine spending obligations. Rome's budget was consumed heavily by military spending. It needed to defend an enormous empire, with borders stretching across multiple continents. At the same time, Rome funded massive social welfare programs like the grain dole, designed to keep the urban population fed and politically pacified. The modern United States federal budget has a similar structural pressure. It is dominated by a combination of enormous military spending, the largest military spending in the world by a wide margin, and enormous entitlement and social program spending, including Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Together, these programs consume the majority of the federal budget. Rome discovered that two spending categories were extremely difficult to cut: external defense and internal welfare. Once citizens grew dependent on them, reducing them became politically dangerous. American political leaders have discovered something similar across multiple decades, across multiple parties. Military and entitlement spending remain extremely difficult to meaningfully reduce, even when fiscal pressure keeps rising, because the political cost of cutting either one is often immediate, visible, and brutal, while the cost of borrowing against the future feels distant, abstract, and easier to ignore. There is also a striking parallel in how both economies handled wealth concentration and its relationship with social stability. In late Roman society, wealthy landowning elites consolidated enormous agricultural estates. These estates were called latifundia. They often absorbed the land of smaller independent farmers who had been financially ruined by debt, currency instability, and the economic pressures of an empire in decline. This created an increasingly divided Roman economy. On one side stood an extraordinarily wealthy landowning class. On the other side stood a growing population of landless, economically desperate citizens. Many of these citizens eventually became tenant farmers, bound to the land in conditions that historians say foreshadowed medieval feudalism. Modern America has experienced its own trend toward wealth concentration, and that trend is significant and well documented. Over recent decades, an increasing share of national wealth has been held by a small percentage of the population. At the same time, median wages for many workers have grown more slowly than overall economic growth, and more slowly than corporate profitability. This is a contested topic among modern economists, and it is still actively debated. There are different views on its causes, and different views on its consequences. But the structural similarity to late Roman wealth concentration is difficult to ignore. Economic historians often point to this pattern as something worth studying carefully, not as proof that the same outcome must happen, but as a warning. Extreme wealth concentration has historically correlated with social and political instability across multiple civilizations, across multiple eras, and across very different economic systems. Trade dependency is another area where the comparison becomes genuinely fascinating. At its economic peak, Rome depended heavily on grain imports, especially from Egypt and North Africa. Those imports helped feed the empire's enormous urban population, especially the city of Rome itself. That meant any disruption to those trade routes could become dangerous. Piracy could create shortages. Political instability could create shortages. Military conflict could create shortages. And food shortages could quickly become social unrest. Modern America has its own version of this vulnerability. It depends on complex, globally interconnected supply chains. For semiconductor chips, pharmaceutical ingredients, basic consumer goods, and countless products people rarely think about until they disappear. This dependency became strikingly visible in recent years. Global supply chain disruptions suddenly became everyday problems. Delays in manufacturing halfway around the world turned into empty shelves at home. They turned into rising prices, long waits, and sudden shortages. Both civilizations discovered the same uncomfortable economic truth. Enormous prosperity built on complex trade networks creates enormous efficiency, but it also creates enormous vulnerability. The same interconnected systems that generate wealth during stable times can transmit crisis during unstable times. They can transmit shortage. They can transmit inflation. And they can do it with startling speed. Let's talk about the genuine, actionable economic lessons this comparison offers. Because this is not simply an exercise in doom and gloom, it is a useful framework. A framework for understanding how large, complex economies behave under pressure. The first lesson is that currency debasement functions like a hidden tax. In ancient Rome, it happened through silver dilution. In modern economies, it can happen through monetary expansion. Different tools, same basic effect. Purchasing power slowly erodes, gradually enough that citizens often do not recognize the full cost. Not until their standard of living has already been meaningfully damaged. The second lesson is about economies built on continuous expansion. Rome depended heavily on military conquest. Modern economies often depend on consumer debt, credit expansion, and constant growth expectations. But every expansion model eventually confronts a mathematical limit. At some point, the easy growth slows, and the transition away from that expansion phase becomes painful, often more painful than continuing the expansion appeared to be, at least in the short term. The third lesson is that government price controls rarely solve inflation, however well-intentioned they may be. History shows this pattern again and again. Price controls address the symptom, rising prices, but not the underlying cause. That cause is usually an oversupply of currency, relative to available goods and services. When governments command prices to stay low without fixing the monetary problem, shortages often follow. The fourth lesson, maybe the most important one: public trust in a currency is incredibly valuable and genuinely fragile. The same is true for trust in economic institutions. Rome took centuries to build that trust, but only a few generations of poor decisions to seriously damage it. That is why modern central banks study monetary credibility so carefully, and why governments worry so deeply about inflation expectations. Because once people stop believing in the money, the crisis becomes much harder to control. It is important to address the limits of this comparison honestly. Rome and modern America are not identical civilizations. They are not facing identical circumstances. And drawing the comparison too literally would oversimplify both systems. These are two complex economies, separated by nearly 2,000 years, separated by technology, institutions, data, finance, and social evolution. Rome operated without modern central banks, without floating exchange rates, without sophisticated economic modeling, and without real-time data analysis. Modern policymakers can monitor economic conditions in ways Roman emperors never could. The United States also has institutional safeguards that Rome did not possess: an independent Federal Reserve, established financial regulators, a diversified economy, advanced technology, and a much deeper financial system. Many of these institutions were built in response to past financial crises. They were designed specifically to prevent uncontrolled monetary collapse, the kind of collapse that devastated Rome. So this comparison should not be understood as a prediction. It does not mean America is destined to collapse the way Rome did. That would be too simplistic. Instead, it should be understood as a historical lens, a way to recognize warning signs, structural pressures, and recurring economic patterns. Patterns that emerge whenever a dominant currency-issuing empire faces a dangerous gap, a gap between its spending ambitions and its actual productive capacity. The decline of the Western Roman Empire did not happen in one single dramatic economic collapse. There was no one identifiable moment when the entire system suddenly fell apart. The final symbolic moment came in 436. That was when the last Western Roman emperor was deposed, but the economic decline had been building for decades. Currency debasement, military overextension, wealth concentration, and eroding public trust all compounded gradually. The system weakened piece by piece, until it could no longer sustain itself. External pressures made the crisis worse, including invasions by various groups, but internal economic dysfunction had already hollowed the empire from within. This is perhaps the most important structural lesson in the Roman story, and it applies to any large, complex economic system. Collapse rarely arrives as one sudden event. It rarely gives historians one clean date on a calendar. Instead, it arrives gradually, then all at once. It is built from countless decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. Decisions made across generations, each one solving an immediate problem, each one slightly mortgaging the future, until the future finally comes due. So why does an economic system that fully collapsed over 1,500 years ago still matter today? Especially to anyone trying to understand the American economy. Because Rome gives economists something rare: a complete, multi-century case study. A case study of what happens when a dominant global power reaches the limits of expansion, especially a power that issues a trusted currency. Rome faced the mathematical limits of unlimited growth, and again, it made the same choice. It solved short-term political problems through currency manipulation, instead of confronting harder structural choices directly. Every time modern economists debate national debt, Rome's shadow is there. Every time policymakers discuss how to maintain a strong and trusted currency, the same tension returns, especially while funding enormous military and social spending obligations. Every time analysts warn about wealth concentration, Rome appears again. Because extreme wealth concentration can weaken long-term social and political stability, these are not new problems. They are ancient structural tensions, the same tensions that quietly unraveled the most powerful economy the ancient world had ever produced. And perhaps that is the most sobering lesson this comparison leaves behind. Rome did not fall because its citizens were simply foolish, and it did not fall because its institutions were poorly designed by the standards of their time. It fell, in significant part, because short-term choices kept defeating long-term survival. Solving today's problem by quietly borrowing against tomorrow felt easier. It felt more politically survivable, and at every individual decision point, it seemed reasonable. Across multiple generations, those decisions compounded, one small compromise after another, one delayed reform after another, one future burden after another, until the structural crisis became too large for any single emperor, too large for any single reform, and too large for the system itself to absorb. Every great economic power in history has believed one comforting idea, that its own permanence was different, more secure, more advanced, and somehow exempt from the patterns that ended earlier empires. Rome believed that too, for centuries, right up until it could no longer believe it. So the next time you hear a debate about national debt, remember Rome. The next time you hear arguments about currency policy, remember the denarius. The next time politicians discuss the long-term sustainability of government spending, listen carefully. Because you're not just watching a modern political argument, you're watching the same economic tensions that once ran through ancient Rome. Only now they are addressed in modern language, modern charts, modern institutions, and modern confidence. But the underlying question is still the same. Can a powerful economy make hard choices before the future comes due? Or will it keep postponing pain until postponement itself becomes the crisis? History does not give a perfect copy of the future, but it does give warnings, and Rome is one of the loudest warnings ever left behind. If this story changed the way you think about money, empire, and the fragile mathematics holding modern economies together, subscribe to Economy Rewind History. Because history does not repeat itself perfectly, but it never stops rhyming.